Now that we have discussed the Reformation overall, we will be looking at how it went throughout several different countries, and we will start in Denmark-Norway. So, the Reformation in Denmark-Norway and Holstein saw the transition from Roman Catholicism to Lutheranism in the realms ruled by the Danish-based House of Oldenburg in the first half of the 16th century. After the breakup of the Kalmar Union in 1521/1523, these realms included the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway, which included Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, and the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, whereby Denmark also extended over today's Gotland, which is now part of Sweden, and Oslo and Estonia. The Protestant Reformation reached Holstein and Denmark in the 1520s. Lutheran figures like Hans Tausen gained considerable support in the population and from Christian II, and though the latter's successor Frederick I officially condemned the Protestant ideas, he tolerated their spread. His son Christian III officially introduced Lutheranism into his possessions in 1528, and on becoming king in 1536 after the Count's War, Lutheranism became official in all of Denmark and Norway. The Roman Catholic bishops were removed and arrested, and the church was reorganized based on Lutheran church orders drawn up by Luther's friend Johannes Bugenhagen in 1537 in Denmark-Norway and 1542 in Holstein. The Lutheran order established during the Protestant Reformation is the common root of the Church of Denmark, the Church of Norway, the Church of Iceland, and the Church of the Faroe Islands. It also triggered Denmark's unsuccessful involvement in the 30 Years' War under Christian IV, who led the defense of a Protestant coalition against the Catholic League's counter-reformation. The Roman Catholic Archbishop of Uppsala in Sweden, Gustav Trolle, supported by Pope Leo X, was in conflict with the Swedish regent Sten Sture the Younger and Sweden's parliament, the Riksdag, due to the parliament's demolition of the Archbishop's Almares Staket castle in 1518. Trolle was pro-Kalmar Union and was allied with Christian II, who made a unionist conquest of Sweden in the autumn of 1520. Trolle was reinstated as bishop, and the Stockholm bloodbath was carried out. Trials in Stockholm in November 1520 led to a series of immediate executions of 84 people, many of them MPs. The Pope gave Trolle the right in writing to excommunicate the parliament by canon law from the Roman Catholic Church and execute them as heretics, and interdict were announced against them. Trolle was soon forced to flee to Denmark in 1521 during the Swedish War of Liberation, during which Gustav Vasa came to power in Sweden with the support of the excommunicated parliament. Despite Trolle's position and his support for the Pope, Gustav Vasa refused to recognize him as Archbishop and rejected him as a traitor. The pressure from Rome was a contributing factor for why Gustav Vasa never re-established the relation with the Vatican, and introduced Protestantism by initiating the Reformation in Sweden. While in Denmark, Trolle somehow also ended up on the losing side of political conflict by backing Christian II, who had been deposed and replaced as king by Frederick I of Denmark and Frederick's successor Christian III of Denmark. As enemies of Christian II and Trolle, Frederick I of Denmark and later Christian III of Denmark also had a strained relationship with the papacy, who backed the Roman Catholic Christian II. At the end of the war in 1536, when Christian III entered Copenhagen, Archbishop Torben Bille was arrested along with two other bishops who were in the city at the time. The other bishops of the kingdom were also arrested around the country. The nobles took power, and the king called for a Lord's Day in Copenhagen on the 20th of October 1536, and thus it was decided that the bishops would be deposed and their estates would be confiscated by the crown. The cathedral chapters and monasteries were allowed to continue their activities until they were reformed. The monks of the monasteries were allowed to leave the monasteries, but if they chose to stay, they would preach Lutheran texts. Christian III also demanded that the councillors assure that no future bishop would be allowed to exercise secular power in Denmark. Christian III worked to organize a national church, which was independent from the papacy in Rome and the Roman Catholic Church. A new church order was drawn up by order of the king in 1537 and could be implemented in final form in 1539. The bishops were replaced as diocesan chiefs by superintendents, a title which, however, would become short-lived and soon return to the name bishop. These would be appointed by the king, and they would not be allowed to earn any major income. The parish priests were instructed to preach the gospel, and the congregation was to be brought up in the gospel doctrine. Lutheran catechism was introduced for children, and thus the Reformation had been fully implemented in Denmark. Already in 1525, Hans Tausen, a Knights Hospitaller from the monastery of Antvorskov, had begun preaching Lutheran doctrines in Viborg. In the years hereafter, the Lutheran movement began spreading throughout the country, and although Frederick I had pledged in his charter to fight against Lutheranism, he nevertheless issued an edict to the citizens of Viborg in 1526, obliging them to protect Hans Tausen. The Protestant movement quickly gained great influence in Denmark, although humanists like Poul Helgesen long tried to maintain a reform movement within the Roman Catholic Church instead of abolishing it altogether as the Lutherans would. During the first years of the 1530s, the king's passivity encouraged the people to attack monasteries and churches. Former King Christian II, who had lived in exile since 1526, took advantage of the unrest and issued propaganda writings, agitating for himself and the new Lutheran doctrine. When Frederick I died in 1533, the Council of the Realm could not come to an agreement on who should be the new king. A Roman Catholic majority preferred Frederick's 12-year-old son, Hans the Elder of Schleswig-Holstein-Haderslev, while a minority supported Hans's half-brother Christian, who as Duke of Schleswig and Holstein had introduced Lutheranism there during the 1520s. The election of a new king was postponed for a year due to the disagreement. In the meantime, the Council of the Realm governed the country, allowing the bishops to decide what could be preached in their respective dioceses. Moreover, Hans Tausen was accused of heresy and banished from Zealand, but the Bishop of Roskilde called him back after only 1 month. Discontent with the nobility taking over control of the country through the council made citizens from Malmo and Copenhagen, along with peasants, especially from northern Jutland, rally around exiled King Christian II. In January 1534, the city government of Malmo, led by Mayor Jørgen Koch, refused to comply with an order from the Bishop of Lund to expel the Lutheran preachers. Malmo had already for long been a center of Lutheran activities and responded to the order by occupying Malmo Castle and arresting the overlord. In May, this rebellion was followed up by the German Count Christopher of Oldenburg attacking Holstein. He had been hired by Koch of Malmo and Wollenwever of Lübeck to conquer Denmark, officially in order to restore King Christian II. Count Christopher's participation in the following 2 years of civil war named it the Count's Feud. The Count's main objective was not Holstein, but Zealand, where he sailed, and he quickly gained control of all Danish territory east of the Great Belt. On the 4th of July, 1534, representatives of Jutlandic nobility and councillors met in Rye in eastern Jutland. Here, the lesser nobility forced the bishops to nominate the Lutheran Christian Duke of Schleswig and Holstein to the kingship. When the nobility of Funen joined them, Christian agreed and homage was paid to him as King Christian III on the 18th of August of that year in Horsens. After both Funen and Jutland had rebelled and Sweden and Prussia had become involved in the war in Scania, Lübeck withdrew from the struggle in January 1536, and on the 6th of April Malmo surrendered, though without losing either privileges or Lutheran doctrine. After the population had starved for months, Copenhagen gave up too, and Mayor Ambrosius Bogebinder committed suicide. Like Malmo, Copenhagen did not lose its privileges either, and the rebels were granted an amnesty. Christian III marched into Copenhagen on the 6th of August, 1536, and 6 days later he carried out a coup. The 3 bishops who dwelt in Copenhagen were arrested, and the rest were tracked down and likewise arrested. The official reason was their hesitation to elect Christian as king, and other alleged criminal acts. The real reason was, however, that Christian wanted to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, carrying through a Lutheran Reformation and confiscating the bishop's properties, the profits from which was needed to cover expenses of the recently ended civil war. Before Christian III came to power in all Denmark-Norway after the Count's Feud, he had already implemented the Protestant Reformation in his realms of Haderslev and Torning, 2 domains in southern Jutland which he had received in 1524. It convinced Lutherans since his encounter with Luther at the Diet of Worms in 1521. Christian III introduced a Lutheran church order in his domains in 1528, laid out in the 22 Haderslev Articles. In 1536, he wanted to implement a similar order for the whole kingdom. The Haderslev Articles had already introduced the office of a superintendent, and the rest of the bishops, who had not supported his election and neither were willing to bear any of his war costs, and this made way to the assignment of Lutheran superintendents in all of Denmark-Norway. After the coup, Christian III had contacted Martin Luther and Johannes Bugenhagen, whom he had first met in 1529, and both of them congratulated the king. His subsequent request to John Frederick I, Elector of Saxony, to immediately deploy Melanchthon or Bugenhagen to Denmark was denied, but the elector was willing to do so once a rough draft of a Danish Lutheran church order had been provided by Danish theologians. Christian III could thereby rely on a pool of capable Danish Lutherans who all had studied at the University of Wittenberg. A synod was held in Odense where the draft was begun, and the work continued in Hatterslav thereafter. The first draft was based primarily on the Hatterslav articles, also on the Saxon script, Visitators' lessons, on Bugenhagen's Of Several Christian Matters, on the liturgical writings of Luther, and Danish liturgical writings. In April 1537, the draft was sent to Wittenberg for approval, whereupon the elector allowed Bugenhagen to depart for Denmark. After Bugenhagen had revised and amended the draft, it was translated from Latin to Danish and presented to the Rigsrådet. After a second revision by Bugenhagen, the church order was completed and signed by Christian III on the 2nd of September 1537 as the church order of the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway and the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein. In Denmark, even 7 superintendencies were established, replacing the former bishoprics. The king was to have no theological authority besides approving the superintendents, and the superintendents were not to hold feasts or secular offices, a rule which would not be followed strictly. Likewise, Christian III would often intervene in the church's affairs. The church order turned against the veneration of saints, fast days, celibacy, and every other papistic foolery, and instead it decreed church services to be performed in Danish. Most monks and nuns were allowed to stay in their monasteries and convents, and the priests were allowed to keep their churches until they died. Only when the last monk or nun had died was the monastery added to the property of the crown. Thus, in spite of more fierce procedures, followed especially by Bishop Peter Palladius on Zealand, the Reformation became a relatively bloodless affair in Denmark. A Danish translation of the Latin Ordinatio Ecclesiastica was approved by the Rigsrådet as a law in 1539. Bugenhagen left Denmark during the same year, but returned in 1542 to mediate negotiations with the gentry of Holstein, who had delayed the implementation of the church order there. On the 9th of March 1542, the church order of Schleswig-Holstein was approved by the Landtag in Rendsburg, after a revision by Bugenhagen. Implementation of the church order in Norway proved more difficult, and even more so in Iceland, where it was implemented only in 1552 after the execution of John Erisson in 1550, and contested by the local population until the 17th century. In addition to working on the Danish church order, Bugenhagen also crowned Christian III and his wife Dorothea with a Lutheran ritual on the 12th of August 1537, the king's 34th birthday and the first anniversary of the arrest of the Roman Catholic bishops. The coronation, as well as the inauguration of the superintendents, which was also performed by Bugenhagen, took place in Our Lady's Church in Copenhagen. Also in 1537, the University of Copenhagen, which had been closed since the Count's War, was modeled by Bugenhagen after Wittenberg was reopened as a Lutheran university. In 1550, the Christian III Bible was first printed, a translation of Luther's Bible by Christian Pedersen on behalf of Christian III. The Reformation in Norway was accomplished by force in 1537 when Christian III declared Lutheranism as the official religion of Norway, sending the Roman Catholic Archbishop Olav Engelbrektsson into exile. Roman Catholic priests and bishops were persecuted, monastic orders were suppressed, and the crown took over church property, while some churches were plundered and abandoned and even destroyed. Bishops were appointed by the king. The first superintendent was Gjeble Pedersen, who served as superintendent of Bjørgvin from 1537 to 1557. In 1537, Christian III also made Norway a hereditary kingdom in a real union with Denmark that would last until 1814, when Frederick VI ceded Norway to Charles XIII of Sweden.